So a really warm welcome, everyone, to this, our fourth in the series of Did You Cop That from Our Shared World. Shortly, I'm going to hand you over to my co-chair, Anne Finlayson, who's going to frame this event for us, give it a bit of context, both in terms of Our Shared World and the whole series of Cop That conversations, and why we decided it would be that we would want to focus on the Environment Act and 25-year environment plan as well. What I should say, as Our Shared World, that this event is being facilitated by a team, because Our Shared World is a large coalition. So there's a sort of a group of us. So in addition to myself, Andrea Bullivant, I'm one of the co-chairs and I represent the Consortium of Development Education Centres, as does my colleague Ellie Langthorne, also one of the co-chairs of Our Shared World. In addition to Ellie and myself facilitating today, there will be Anne Finlayson from SEED, as mentioned, and Holly Everett from Reboot the Future. So it'll be the four of us. We'll be sort of handing backwards and forwards between. Just now, I'm going to hand over to Anne.
Hello. Just to remind everyone that when Our Shared World was set up over 2 years ago, it really was out of a concern that SDG 4.7 was not really taking much a hold in England in particular, and felt that we ought to be pushing for this within England, but would also like to learn from other countries. So if we go to the next slide. So today's event is one of several that we're running post COP26. And the title of this, Did You Cop That, came from another member of the group, Clive Beljohn. And really it was because we felt that there were certain voices at COP26 and we weren't hearing them all. So we did want to hear other voices and perspectives. We've also looked at other countries' pledges to education for climate change and sustainability. And our last event that 170 people signed up for was the DFE's draft strategy on sustainability and climate change education. And we looked at, in particular, their roadmap and their strategic aims. And that was a very fruitful session. There are also other policies that are around. I mean, there are ones in the environment, some of which you might know about, some of which you don't know about, which potentially have got an impact on what we do in terms of education, not just content, but how schools operate, the environments within which they sit. So in 2018, there was the 25-year plan, which came out of a white paper that all sorts of things had been mentioned in before. Some of those have now gone. But what we've got is this 25-year plan, which is still in operation. And then at the end of last year, the Environment Act 2021 came in, which is much more about laws, regulations and governance after leaving the EU, because those were the laws that used to control what we're doing. If we could get to the next slide. So we will be in this session exploring those environmental policies in relation to education. And they cover things like connecting people with the environment to improve health and well-being, encouraging children to be close to nature in and out of school. There's a concept called nature-friendly schools, which we'll be hearing a bit more about. There's ideas about greening urban environments. And there's this new thing called net biodiversity gain, which is not just conserving what we have, but actually improving biodiversity in the UK. And we're going to be listening to different responses and ideas and policies from our 5 speakers, including the expected impacts of climate change on their own lives or where they live or the work that they do. Next slide. Not forgetting, though, that the DFE draft strategy has 4 strategic aims: excellence in education, net zero, resilient to climate change, which I think is a very interesting one, And the last one, which is sort of maybe more relevant to this, a better environment for future generations, especially through two ideas that they have, the National Education Nature Park and this Climate Leaders Award.
Anna's provided some of the context, both in relation to Our Shared World. For those of you who perhaps might be very new to Our Shared World, and this might be the first conversation that you've been able to participate in, but also some of that context around the Environment Act and 25-year Environment Plan. And very shortly, Debbie Tripley is going to help us all, I think, to understand the context of that. And stimulate our thinking perhaps about what that means in our educational work and settings. And then we're going to move to a range of contributions and perspectives. You can see the names of the people listed there, and I'll be handing over to my colleague Holly to introduce those. And again, those will be focused particularly on the question of what does this mean for our work in educational settings. I'm going to hand over to Debbie Tripley. So Debbie is Director of Advocacy at WWF UK. As I say, from the conversations we've had with Debbie, I think this is, I've certainly found it really helpful already to talk with her and really start to make the connections between these different strands and areas of policy.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. This is certainly my first occasion to meeting all of you in Our Share World, and really pleased to be talking to you all. I seem to have the unenviable task of trying to take you through what is an enormous new piece of legislation in 10 minutes. So I'm going to do the best I can in the time that I've got. I've loved the examples you've all been sharing of things you've been doing that you love, that you've done in nature. But just as a precursor to my talk, it's fair, I think, to point out that nature and climate are in a critical situation, and you all know that because you've no doubt seen all the headlines about it. But just to point out that statistics demonstrate that nature in the UK has been on the decline since about the 1970s, and there hasn't really been any let up in the net loss of nature in the UK since that time. And really that's despite fairly what I would call progressive European legislation that's been in place for quite some time. And an example of that is, for instance, the Water Framework Directive, which came into force in 2003 and has had plans in place since 2009, and yet we've still only achieved 14% of our rivers at good ecological status. Now just think about that, just 14%, when by 2027, under the Water Framework Directive, we should be at around about 90% of good ecological status. Therefore, the Environment Act, we need to think about it, is coming at a time when it's really clear that we need to have urgent action to bend the curve on the loss of nature. And of course, that applies not only in the UK, but we know very well that applies globally. Now, this is really a cathartic moment for me because I spent 3 years working on the Environment Act, and as the slide there says, the bill took 1,056 days, came law on the 15th of November. We got through 2 secretaries of state, 2 prime ministers, and it was announced in 3 Queen's speeches. That shows, I suppose, a commitment by government to have this piece of legislation. But you must be wondering why they have done it. Well, we need to go back in time a bit to understand that. And we need to go back, first of all, to January 2018, when the government introduced the 25-year Environment Plan. And that showed, I think, recognition by the government of the dire situation that nature is in. It's obviously a precursor to the Environment Act, but to be honest, the Environment Act wasn't even in government's minds at that time. And of course, we hadn't Brexited. So the 25-year Environment Plan is conceived as a fairly high-level policy document and is meant to stand alone alongside all of our existing EU environmental legislation, of which there's a considerable amount. But it is novel. I think this is perhaps the takeaway. It's novel in so much as it fixes on targets. So it tries to be what we call outcome focused through the targets, rather than in the way that environmental legislation has historically or traditionally been, which is focused on general principles of conservation and protection. And we know that those principles, as I've demonstrated through the decline of nature, haven't really helped us improve or halt the decline in nature. And that's what we really want to do now, is halt and reverse that decline and start to restore what we've lost. 25-year environment plan doesn't replace the EU legislation, and one might think cynically that that was initially its intention, that it was a precursor in getting ready to do that, but it hasn't done that. And also, I think some people have said that the targets are pretty underwhelming, and the 25-year environment plan sets targets over a 25-year time period. Lots of our EU legislation has shorter time periods within which, like the Water Framework Directive, within which you're supposed to achieve certain targets. So again, a cynic might say, well, it's extending that period of time over which we're trying to halt and restore nature. What I think it does do differently is that through the targets, it gives a level of detail on how to achieve nature's restoration, and it does that over 6 chapters, which covers water, air, various other chapters. I'm not going to go into that because of time, but it interestingly also has a chapter on including improving the global environment. So when the Environment Bill was drafted, what it did with the 25-year environment plan, it gave it legal status, and I think that's an important thing to clock. So now those targets that are still being set through the 25-year environment plan also are underpinned by law in the Environment Act. And we see that in Section 8 of the Environment Act, which says that 25-year environment plan is to be known as an environmental improvement plan for significantly improving the natural environment. And that's quite important. So I'm going to move on to the Environment Act. So to understand, I think, the genesis and context of the Environment Act, I think you need to be aware of a couple of things. First of all, the Environment Act is a product of us leaving the EU, but it doesn't replace existing EU environmental laws. They all came across with the EU Withdrawal Act. It may be in time that it will do that, but currently it doesn't. And therefore, the Environment Act should be seen as offering additional levels of protection to all of that EU acquis that we have retained. So why do we have it if we've got all this existing EU law? Well, first of all, as I said, the EU law may not remain forever, and governments started to chip away at some of the existing environmental laws we've got. But second, the reason we've got it is because the government had its hands tied. It had to bring in some sort of primary legislation because it had to replace the European Commission's complaints process that we have all enjoyed over the period of being EU citizens. We have been able to complain to the European Commission for the implementation or poor and unlawful or illegal implementation of EU laws. Of course, now we've left the EU, we no longer have that independent complaints mechanism. And NGOs fought really hard to say to the government, you have to replace that with a new body. So part of what the Environment Act does and why it had to come into being was because the government accepted that and have now put in place a new independent complaints body, which is called the Office of Environmental Protection. And that's empowered to investigate complaints, bring judicial review against the government and other public bodies. It's not very perfect. It sets up a really complex complaints system, in my view. It's not as effective as the EU Complaints Commission, EU Commission complaints process, which was really quite simple. And it's got really limited judicial powers. So moving on to what's in the Environment Act, well, as I've said, it's a really big bill. And there are several innovations that are interesting to note. So first of all, you will probably hear, if you do any planning in the future, the term net gain. That's going to become very common language. How do you, as a planning, when you're applying for planning, how do you show that your planning application is producing a net gain to the environment? And there's another new mechanism, legal mechanism that has been introduced called conservation covenants. That's a very new way of tying conservation to land. And a further innovation is around local nature recovery networks. So now I'm going to dive a bit more into some of the big hitters, what I think are the big hitters in the Environment Act. And the first of those, so I'm not going to run through the slides, I'm going to let you read the slides, but I'm going to talk around them. So the first I want to talk about is halving the loss of nature. And the NGOs really fought hard for this as an overarching objective. We scored, I think, a major victory in getting the government to put this into the Environment Act. It comes in at section 3.1, and it places a duty on the Secretary of State to set a target for the abundance of species. And that target is a 2030 target. So he has to hit this over the next 8 years. And what he has to do is halt a decline in the abundance of species by 2030. That's a huge step forward for us in the NGO sector. Second is principles, environmental principles in the Environment Act. This was part of the EU acquis, all of these environmental principles. They were legally a legal requirement in the EU legislative framework. They've come across not as a legally binding in the same way. They've come across as the government developing policy, a policy statement to require all ministers to have due regard to all of these principles when setting policy. We lost the legal argument, I think, on that, but nevertheless, we have managed to retain the principles in some shape or form in law.
Debbie, we might have to just say one more minute.
Okay, so the next thing is the OEP. Lots to say about the OEP. As I said, very complex. You can have access to these slides so you can see what's part of the OEP. And then air quality, which sets this particulate target, which I think is quite important. And the final chapter that I wanted to talk about was water, where Philip Dunn MP launched a campaign and managed to amend the Environment Act to get these duties in to prepare a plan for storm overflow. And you've all heard about lots on that, no doubt, in the news around sewage in rivers and the adverse harm that they're having on the environment. He managed to get a whole chapter into the Environment Act that talks to that. So well done to him on achieving that. And the final thing I wanted to say was check out due diligence, which is in the Environment Act, which WWF fought for. That stops the importation in supply chains of commodities that cause deforestation. That's a real innovation as well. And I can stop there. I think I've done it.
Thank you, Debbie, so much. I think we set you a big challenge as well to cover a lot in a very
there is a lot
time.
that I haven't covered, but you know, others will see that if they dive into the bill or the act.
Yeah. So I'm just going to share my slides very briefly, and so that you can see where we're heading to next. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague Holly.
Thanks, Andrea. So I'm really honoured today to be able to introduce some of our speakers. We're joined today by Sarah Collins, who is the co-lead of the Nature Premium campaign. We've also got Jenny Teague with us, who is the Nature Friendly Schools project manager. We've got Laman Tarawali, Chair of Youth Advisory Board, Voyage Youth. And we've got Vix Lothian, the education spokesperson for the Green Party. So for each of our speakers, we're going to ask them the same question, and I'll turn to each of them in turn, which is this: how do we connect with the Environment Act and the 25-year plan in the work that we do in educational settings? We'll have a couple of minutes each. What I might do is, if I unmute, then that's a little sign for you that maybe it might be time to move on to the next person. So just maybe keep an eye out for me if you're speaking. But first of all, I'd love to ask Sarah, so how do we connect with the Environment Act and 25-year plan in our work in education settings? Over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm co-leading the Nature Premium campaign, and I would argue that this is an answer to your question. How do we coordinate? So the Nature Premium campaign, we're asking for the government to guarantee that all children have regular nature experiences through the mechanism of a Nature Premium in early years schools and colleges, with additional funding for those children in urban and deprived areas. We use a broad definition of nature, from gardening to planting trees to conservation work, farming, and working in local community to improve biodiversity. We believe that the Nature Premium will support all children's and young people's mental and physical well-being, and connect them with nature and help them develop the knowledge and skills necessary to live a sustainable life and contribute to a green economy. And we believe that all children need to have a green tinge, so that everyone considers how their individual decisions has an impact on the local and wider environment. This isn't just about STEM subjects. This is all children. And this is fully in line with the aspects of the 25-year Green Future Improvement Plan. So over the past few years, as the Environment Bill has been debated, I've seen many calls to use nature-based solutions, and I've responded that the Nature Premium would be one of the best nature-based solutions. Imagine a generation of lawyers, biologists, hairdressers, farmers, musicians, manufacturers, engineers, doctors, company directors, lobbyists, politicians, special advisors who understand how their decisions have an impact on the environment. And imagine a generation who have spent a significant amount of time in nature. Research shows that the more time you spend in nature, the more pro-environment you become. And they would know that you can't just plant trees to replace nature woodland, or that pouring raw sewage into a stream is not a good idea, and would look for creative solutions or call for politicians to legislate to prevent them from happening in the first place. I'd argue that there are good things in the Environment Act, and many politicians, conservationists, scientists and NGOs have persisted to make it so. But without a generation that's making pro-sustainable living and pro-environment commitments, we won't have a workforce to deliver the ambitions of the Act. David Attenborough said, "No one will protect what they don't care about, and no one will care about what they've never experienced." And in the same vein, no one would choose a career in a discipline they don't care about, and no one will make career choices in something they have never experienced. An example of the Environment Act requires local highway authorities to consult with communities before felling street trees, unless the trees qualify for certain exemptions. It's the exemptions that are the worrying phrase, and we need planners, surveyors, councillors, engineers, builders and residents to understand the value of street trees to the community's health. So people put the inconvenience of leaves and honeydew way below trees' contribution to well-being and its own magnificence. It also contains a whole section on deforestation board and brings in a new system to reduce illegal deforestation around the world through England's supply chains. However, the Act only prohibits deforestation which is considered illegal in the country it happens in. And as already mentioned, there's due diligence requirements placed on businesses, including a duty to establish a system for identifying, assessing and mitigating the risk of illegally produced forest commodities entering their supply chain. But we need...
I'm just going to have to, sorry, cut you off there. I hate to interrupt you mid-flow, but I would love to hear from our other speakers as well. So thank you, Sarah. And again, if anyone has any questions for you in particular, they can message you in the chat. I'm sure you'll be able to get back to them. Thank you so much. Jen, I'd like to move on to you now, if that's all right. How do we connect with the Environment Act 25-year plan in our work in education?
That's fine. I am just going to switch my camera off. I keep getting a low bandwidth message, so I'm going to, apologies, I'm just going to turn my video off. Good evening, everyone. Really great to be here. So as Anne mentioned at the start, my name's Jen and I work for the Royal Society of Wildlife Trusts, heading up the Nature Friendly Schools programme. We are the largest of 3 projects that sit under Children and Nature, which came directly out of the 25-year environment plan. So we are a live example delivery project of how the plan is delivering on the ground. We work with 10 national partners, including 6 of our own wildlife trusts, delivering a 12-month programme of progressive outdoor learning experiences and practical interventions in schools with the highest free school meal status. And our project outcomes are pupil-centric that seek to improve mental health and well-being, engagement with school, and care and concern for the environment. But in order to do that, our modus operandi is through developing teacher confidence. So our directive from our funders, Department for Education and DEFRA, was to not only boost a load of funding into schools, but actually to train the teachers to be able to maximise the benefits of that, to make sure that children had more regular access to learning in and about nature. So since 2019, we've worked with 48,000 pupils and 500 teachers across 187 schools across the breadth of England, providing a blended package of practical support to green grounds, and that's supported by a programme of continual professional development for the teachers in an ambition to raise the aspiration and confidence to increase the amount of outdoor learning taking place across key stages. And we had a particular focus on increasing resilience in young people. So the activities that we were delivering with our teachers focused on outdoor learning and improving mental health and well-being, as well as some really strong curriculum links that went much broader than STEM subjects, just as Sarah mentioned in her presentation. Unfortunately, COVID recovery was cited as the reason to divert the funding for our 3rd and final year of the project. So we're just currently consolidating all of our learning from the programme and getting quite heavily involved in the working groups for the DFE Sustainability and Climate Change Strategy, and taking some of the learnings from the 25-year Environment Plan Live projects through into that. And our initial findings are really clearly screaming at the fact that the training for teachers is one of the most critical enablers to getting young people connected to the world around them, to get them interested in climate and sustainability, but that the teachers coming through the system themselves lack the practical skills and application and confidence to take that journey forwards. So one of the key things that we are pushing back on when it comes to the strategy in particular is the need for outdoor learning to be brought to the fore as a method of pedagogy when it comes to teacher training practices. We want to see all young people having access to at least 2 hours of outdoor education every week. And Holly, I don't know if you've come off mute because I'm coming to the end of my time.
Perfect, I have.
I'll leave it there.
Brilliant, thanks so much, Jen. Great stuff there. Alamin, over to you. How do you think we can connect with the Environment Act 25-year plan?
So how do we connect with the Environment Act? And I think that the first step here is understanding, so acknowledging, really. I think and then acknowledging, then understanding that there's a sort of broad disconnect between these sort of policies and the communities that we're trying to ensure that the issues of climate change and sustainability penetrate and in the forefront of their minds. And when we look at, when we say disconnect of the community, I'm talking about broad disconnect. I'm not necessarily just speaking from the BAME experience. However, when we know there is a disconnect, those who are sort of at the worst end of that stick are those from sort of Black and ethnic minorities. And looking at figures, 3% of those within sort of sustainability sort of identify themselves coming from an ethnic minority background is really sort of hard and depressing to see. And with sort of us at Voyage here communicating with young BAME people in and around East and North London, it really hurts because we're able to see some of how they are sort of concerned about some of these core issues. You have to remember that lots of these young people that we're speaking to, some may sort of come from Nigeria, and you look at sort of, coastal cities such as Lagos and some of the issues around there and flooding. And then, some of our young people are also from the Caribbean islands who are, would be in the worst end of the stick when it comes to climate change. So what we do see, one, is that there's a disconnect between the community, and then two, it's very much unpleasant that there's a disconnect, but also we have access to these young people who are really concerned. We do speak about these issues. We even hold sessions at Voyage about these issues, and we have our young people speak about some of the solutions, but also what really sort of bothers them. Again, And I think once we acknowledge that, then we have a good layout of the scene. And Voyager's answer is actually one. How about we band together all the community stakeholders? So not just schools, but schools plus local council members and organizations such as Voyage. How do we actually utilize our expertise and our resources to be able to cater to young people? Because we all have we're all good at different things, and actually if we pull our resources together, if we work together, we'll be able to maximize that impact. But any questions, and I'm happy to answer in the breakout rooms, etc. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Again, another really succinct sort of insight there, taking it from another viewpoint on how we can connect with this Environment Act. So finally, I'm going to pass over to Vix. How do we connect with the Environment Act, the 25-year plan, in our work in educational settings?
Thanks very much, Holly. Yeah, to make the Environment Act and the 25-year plan successful, we've got to keep putting pressure on politicians of all colours to make sure the Act is enforced, to ensure that there is actually resulting net gains of biodiversity in the natural world, and to make progress as quickly as possible. I mean, after hosting COP26, we've seen that the government's doing a little bit more, but is this just lip service and greenwashing? They're passing the Environment Act, which is wide-scoping and promises much, but will it deliver? The publishing of the draft strategy on sustainability and climate change when it comes to schools was very welcome, but whilst such actions are moving in the right direction and providing opportunities to tackle the challenges of 21st century climate change and the pressure on our natural world, they don't often go far enough or reach far enough or provide enough detail to make an impact in the classroom, and especially through prioritising opportunities to engage in the natural world outside of the classroom. I've been a secondary teacher for 20 years and I teach humanities and also geology, and I'm at the end of my Open University degree in STEM and Earth Science, and it's through my adult learning as studying with the Open University that I found out that these are the biggest issues that we face. Where is the strategy to improve knowledge and understanding for adults? This revelation when I started studying that meant that adults, we are the ones who are going to be able to engage much further in the real natural world. And we've seen today the guidance for political impartiality in schools, which specifically mentions the environment and climate change as an example, which is knowledge and factually based, but also has the potential to stray into politics and to be politically partisan. And just like you can't split learning about the natural world from being engaging in the natural world, I think it's difficult to split learning about climate change and biodiversity from solutions and the skills to address these challenges. So education and putting forward the requirements of the Environment Act will require a full range of solutions, and it's not enough for our young people to parrot a stance of the status quo if we're going to take the radical steps to mitigate. And finally, we need to drastically increase the opportunities for our young people of all ages to engage with the nature and the natural world outside of the classroom. It can't be done without time in the natural world. We could see that in the chat today. So I'd like to see the next steps in engaging with the Environment Act to go even faster, to engage adults as well as children, and to empower the curriculum to be bold and impactful and support teachers in putting forward not just knowledge, but political solutions to the climate crisis as well. And so I'm really interested to hear how we can use schools and educators to help put forward the 25-year plan too. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Vix. That was fantastic. And I'm so impressed by all of our speakers for channeling so much information in such a short space of time. I'm sure everyone in the breakout rooms will have lots to say to you. And on that note, I'm going to pass over to Andrea.
Hey, thanks, Holly. Yes, and a huge thank you from me as well for all our to all of our speakers.
That's okay. 4 points that we focused on, and they picked up from the speakers. One was the absolute importance of young people having direct experience of the natural world, and the points that Jen made in her talk about, by having that experience, you become more engaged and so on. Secondly, I'm picking up from Lamin's point, the question of how we make that possible for those who are not already engaged, particularly those from historically excluded groups, including Black and ethnic minority groups and any working class kids. And the third thing, how do we make it so it's a whole school involvement and commitment and not just STEM and geography, but all subjects? And finally, the importance of moving young people towards action and campaigning, and so that they become actively involved in movements for change.
Thanks, Martin.
I'll jump in, Andrea, if I may. Room 2.
Great. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. Thank you also to my group as well. We were fortunate to have 2 of the speakers in our group, and also Juliet Boone, who is part of a charity, religious-based charity, who are running inset days for teachers and really working with teachers to try to get them engaged and taking them out of the city of Birmingham into nature to directly connect there, which was really interesting. So we had a really interesting conversation. And I think the main point which came out was noticing that schools and education in general is now, they know about climate change. They're very good at climate change, arguably, and that's the bit they know about. But actually, the bit which is being lost is the role of nature within that. And so there is a disconnect between the push for climate change and the role of nature. And there were some ideas around actually how those could be brought closer together, including how we link in farming and how we link in food, and helping children and young people to understand how the two link together. How does having a burger, for example, increase our carbon footprint, increase emissions, increase climate change, and so on. So that was really the main point that came out. But yes, some fantastic, interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. I think Clive, maybe.
No, we spent a bit of time saying who we are and what our education setting was, and then my desk lamp blew out and I went into the dark, and I suggested people write a short comment about what their thought was, so we got that recorded. I think people wrote more than I expected, so we didn't get a lot of chance to share it, but some of the things that were touched on was the importance of training for teachers, the importance of engaging with projects in the school and local community and sharing that learning regionally and globally, and the importance of children's voice and young people knowing that they should have rights around this and have their voices heard around it.
Great, thanks, Clive. So I think that is everyone. Yeah. So just within the last couple of moments, is there anything that anybody would like to particularly sort of pick up on, anything that has occurred to you? I'm just, that invitation, I guess, to our speakers in particular, in terms of what you've heard from the conversations in breakouts.
Just to elaborate on that point about the rights, I think it's really crucial that children don't see that this environmental activity is something that's being done to them, but it is their right to live in an environment which is safe for them and to learn how to live sustainably. It is their right under the Convention on the Rights of the Child for them to know that they have that right. And it is their right to know that they have a right to have their views given due weight. And that, for me, needs to be much more centre stage, because that helps to build resilience amongst young people when they know that they have the right to be listened to. I think Greta Thunberg is a good example of that.
Thanks, Edward. That seems like a really a good and interesting point for us to perhaps end on. And I can see Debbie's also just posted into the chat there in relation to the UNHR as well. So thank you for that. It is 6 o'clock, so I'm just going to very quickly share with you. Firstly, to say thank you to everyone for participating, contributing, and of course to our speakers, because this was, it was an area, I think, which some of us were conscious that we, perhaps needed to know more about. So we really do appreciate that, and hope that all of you do too. We've mentioned that this is the fourth in a series of conversations, so we are planning another one. We keep kind of adding to them as well as the momentum sort of continues. So on the 21st of March, we're planning a deep dive into green skills. I think we're seeing green skills in the broadest way possible as well. just to sort of, in case you're not already aware of the DFE draft strategy survey, anonymous survey, as they want to keep emphasising, that they're wanting people to respond to by the 20th of February. And then very finally, if you're not already connected to us, we would love you to join our shared world. If you go to the website there, you can find out much more, and also sign up as well.